Mark, a freelance photographer with a penchant for urban exploration, found himself drawn to a forgotten amusement park deep in the forest. The journey there was filled with an eerie silence, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Upon arrival, the sight of the towering Ferris wheel, its metal frame rusted and covered in creeping vines, filled Mark with a strange mix of fascination and dread. He could barely make out the outline of the carousel in the distance, half hidden behind a cluster of skeletal rides. The deeper he ventured, the more the air around him seemed to grow colder, like an invisible hand pressing down on his shoulders. Each step echoed through the empty park, the crunch of leaves and gravel underfoot a reminder of the stillness that surrounded him. As Mark approached the carousel, a chill ran down his spine. The horses, frozen mid-gallop, were painted in faded hues, their eyes seemingly following him. He paused, and it was then that he noticed the lights, flickering to life, one by one. The dim bulbs, covered in grime, shouldn't have been working. Yet, there they were, glowing faintly, their light casting long, distorted shadows on the nearby trees. Mark's heart began to pound as he took a step closer. The shadows danced as if they had a mind of their own, shifting and twisting into forms that vaguely resembled faces. There was something in those lights, a flicker that seemed more than just an electrical anomaly, a presence, a suggestion of life. He tried to shake off the feeling, but the more he stared, the more convinced he became that he was not alone. As Mark circled the carousel, the sound of faint laughter reached his ears. It was distant, almost ethereal, like the echo of a memory, and yet it was undeniably real. He stopped, turning his head, his breath visible in the sudden drop of temperature. The laughter continued, drifting on the cold air, and he knew it wasn't his imagination. The carousel's horses seemed to shift under his gaze. Their painted mouths widened into sinister smiles, revealing cracks where the paint had chipped away. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and producing a high-pitched, keening sound, almost like a child's cry. Mark's camera, slung around his neck, suddenly felt heavier. He raised it instinctively to his eye and snapped a photo of the carousel. As the camera's flash illuminated the scene, he caught a glimpse of something, a face, twisted in agony, appearing momentarily in the glass window of the carousel's control booth. He lowered the camera quickly, his hands trembling. The control booth was empty, just broken glass and tangled wires hanging from the ceiling. But for that split second, he had seen it. A face that seemed familiar, yet horribly wrong, with hollow eyes that bore into his soul. Mark took a step back, his instinct screaming for him to leave, but his curiosity held him captive. Something metallic caught his eye, an old, rusted plaque bolted onto the base of the carousel. He brushed away the dirt, revealing an inscription. The name on the plaque sent a jolt of terror through his veins. The Carousel of the Dead, Ride to Remember. It was as if the park itself had been waiting for him, drawing him in to witness whatever dark secret lay hidden here. His breath quickened, the laughter grew louder, and he could feel something behind him, watching, waiting. The air was thick with dread, and in that moment, Mark understood. This was not just an abandoned amusement park. It was a place that had been left behind, forsaken, because it was a gateway to something far darker, a doorway to the unknown where the living had no place. As Mark stood frozen in front of Carousel, his eyes caught something familiar amidst the chipped paint and vines. There, atop one of the horses, was a carved symbol, a spiraling scar etched into the neck of the wooden creature. A memory, long buried and almost lost to time, surfaced in his mind. He remembered a toy horse from his childhood, one carved with the same spiral mark, a gift from his grandfather. The horse had been a beloved relic of his youth, a connection to his grandfather's stories about the strange and wonderful places he used to visit. But there was one story in particular that now returned to haunt Mark, the story of a cursed amusement park that had mysteriously closed down decades ago. Mark's grandfather used to speak of a carousel with an almost reverent fear. He described the way the lights danced at night, casting long shadows of figures that shouldn't be there, and how the laughter of children could still be heard even when the park was empty. Mark had dismissed it as a fantastical story, a way to scare children into behaving, but now, standing in front of the very thing his grandfather had described, he felt the weight of those words. It was as if the carousel had been waiting for him all these years, waiting for someone who shared its past to come back. He touched the wooden horse, his fingers brushing over the scarred spiral, and a sudden jolt of cold shot up his arm. His vision blurred, and for a split second, he wasn't in the abandoned park anymore. He was back at his childhood home, in the old living room where his grandfather would sit by the fire, the toy horse resting on his knee. But something was wrong. The fire was out, the room was cloaked in shadows, and his grandfather's face was obscured, his eyes dark and empty. The horse in his hands began to move, its head turning slowly towards Mark, its mouth opening in a grotesque smile. He could hear his grandfather's voice, but it was distorted, as if coming from underwater, whispering words he couldn't understand. Mark blinked, and he was back in the park, the wooden horse still beneath his hand. The carousel was no longer spinning, but the lights flickered erratically, and the laughter had changed. It was closer now, no longer distant, as if the unseen children were circling him, taunting him. He took a step back, his heart pounding, and his gaze fell on the ground beside the carousel. Half buried in the dirt was a small object, something that gleamed under the flickering lights. He knelt down, brushing the earth away, and pulled it free. His blood ran cold as he recognized it. A small, carved horse, identical to the one his grandfather had given him, its spiral scar unmistakable. A sudden wave of nausea washed over him as he realized that this wasn't just a coincidence. The toy, the stories, the carousel, everything was connected. He remembered the day the toy had vanished, his grandfather's frantic search for it, and the strange way he had looked at Mark, as if knowing something terrible was bound to happen. The laughter around him grew louder, and Mark could feel the air press against him, heavy and suffocating. The horses on the carousel seemed to twist, their faces contorting into expressions of anguish, and he knew then that this place had taken more than just a toy from his grandfather. It had taken a part of his soul, a piece of his past that had been lost to the darkness. Mark staggered to his feet, clutching the small horse, and looked around. The shadows seemed to move, closing in, and he felt a presence, a cold, malevolent force that had been waiting for him to uncover the truth. The park wasn't just abandoned. It was cursed, a prison for the lost, a place where memories and souls were trapped forever. And now, it wanted him too. He could feel the weight of the past bearing down on him, the realization that he was not the first to stand here, to confront this darkness. The faces in the lights, the voices in the wind, they were all the ones who had come before, all those who had failed to escape. The carousel was a beacon, drawing in those connected to it, feeding on their fears, their memories, until there was nothing left but shadows and whispers. The realization of the carousel's sinister purpose sank in, and Mark felt an overwhelming dread pressing down on him. The faces in the flickering lights, the agonized expressions of lost souls, seemed to beg for release. It was then that Mark understood why he was here. The carousel wasn't just a cursed relic. It was a vessel, a prison that needed to be fed with more than fear. The whispers grew louder, their tones shifting from mocking to pleading, and Mark felt an inexplicable urge to do something, anything, to make them stop. But the whispers had something else in mind. They wanted an offering. Suddenly, the carved horse in Mark's hand grew unbearably cold, almost burning his skin with an unnatural chill. The whispers converged into a single, distinct voice, a voice that spoke directly into his mind. To free them, you must give what is precious, it murmured, the words echoing in his thoughts. He felt a pressure inside his head, images flashing before his eyes. Memories of his childhood, his grandfather's stories, the moments of joy they shared, all of them were paraded before him like pages torn from an old book, threatened with erasure. Mark realized that the carousel demanded sacrifice, but not a physical one. It wanted something deeper, something that connected him to his past, something precious. It wanted his memories. He could see the faces in the lights become more animated, more desperate, as if they could sense his hesitation. Each of them had been through this before. Each had made their own impossible choice and failed. The carousel fed on those who tried to keep what was most dear, and Mark knew that if he refused, he would be no different from the others, just another face twisted in agony, another soul trapped forever. Trembling, Mark faced his own fear. What would it mean to lose those memories? To forget the warmth of his grandfather's stories, the comforting feeling of sitting by the fire, the love that had shaped his childhood? He could see his grandfather's face in his mind, the deep lines of his smile, the kind eyes that always seemed to hold a secret. The thought of losing those moments forever, of them slipping away into the void, filled him with a profound sorrow. But then he looked around. The carousel, the decaying park, the faces caught between realms, and he knew that these lost souls needed to be freed. Perhaps his sacrifice could be their salvation. The choice was impossible. Keep what defined him, his memories, the essence of who he was, or release them into the darkness to free those who had been caught before. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow as he weighed the options. He looked at the carved horse in his hand, the spiral scar etched on its neck, and he felt a strange connection to it, as if it had always been a part of him. The laughter around him changed again, turning into sobs, cries of despair, and he knew his time was running out. The entity within the carousel was growing impatient, and the air became thicker, colder, the very ground beneath him trembling in anticipation. Mark felt tears streaming down his face. The memories flashed one last time, vibrant and warm, like a movie playing before his eyes. His grandfather's voice echoed, soft and distant, and Mark whispered, "I'm sorry." He closed his eyes and focused on that one memory, the day he first received the carved horse, the joy that filled him, his grandfather's laughter ringing through the house. He let it go, surrendering it to the darkness. The cold surged up his arm, and he felt the memory being pulled from him, unraveling like a thread, slipping into the void. The lights of the carousel flared, a blinding brightness that forced Mark to shield his eyes. He could hear the voices, no longer sobbing but crying out in relief, a chorus of gratitude that echoed through the park. The faces in the lights began to fade, their expressions softening, and Mark felt an emptiness inside him, a void where the memory used to be. The carved horse crumbled to dust in his hand, and he knew that part of his past was gone forever. But the carousel had stopped. The horses were still, the lights dimmed, and the air around him felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Mark looked at the carousel, now just a relic of wood and metal, devoid of the sinister presence that had once inhabited it. He had made the choice, the impossible choice, and though it had cost him dearly, he had freed those who were trapped. Yet, as he stood there, feeling the loss of something he could no longer fully remember, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the carousel had taken more than just a memory. It had taken a piece of his soul, a fragment of his very being, and he knew he would never be the same. The moment Mark made his sacrifice, a tense silence enveloped the abandoned park. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to make its next move. The air felt lighter for a brief moment, and Mark dared to hope that his ordeal was over. But then, a deep chill crept in from all directions, a cold so profound that it seemed to seep into his very bones. The carousel had stopped, but the whispers, soft and sinister, had not. They were back, now closer, wrapping around him like an unseen fog, weaving between the skeletal remains of the rides. The shadows lengthened as the sun began to dip beyond the treetops, and the laughter that had once taunted him turned into a low, murmuring chant, incomprehensible and yet unmistakably menacing. Mark turned in circles, trying to find the source, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke in a language that was ancient, guttural, each word dripping with malice and contempt. It felt as though the very darkness of the park had come alive, and Mark could see movement in the corners of his eyes, dark figure shifting just beyond the edge of his vision. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a vine, and he fell hard against the carousel platform. The wood was ice cold, and as he lay there, struggling to rise, he saw something that made his blood run colder. The shadows cast by the horses were no longer just shadows. They had begun to move independently, writhing and contorting, twisting into grotesque forms that seemed almost human. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched the shadows peel away from the carousel and slither across the ground, surrounding him. One shadow in particular caught his attention, a tall, elongated figure that seemed to be made of pure darkness. It moved with a purpose, inching closer to him, its form flickering and undulating as though it struggled to maintain its shape. Mark felt a presence emanating from it, a sense of hatred so powerful that it almost knocked the wind out of him. The whispering grew louder, the voices now distinct and accusing, each one layering over the other in a cacophony that drowned out all rational thought. He covered his ears, desperate to block out the sound, but it only grew more intense, as if the whispers were inside his head. The dark figure loomed over him, and Mark could see two pinpricks of light where its eyes should have been cold, hollow, and filled with a void that seemed to stretch into infinity. He felt as though those eyes were piercing into his soul, searching for something, and he could feel it, a tugging sensation deep inside, as if the entity was trying to draw out what was left of his memories, of his identity. The shadows on the ground began to coil around his legs, pulling him down, and Mark fought against them, panic surging through his veins. He reached for anything to hold onto, his fingers brushing against the edge of the carousel's control booth. With a surge of desperation, he pulled himself up, breaking free from the grip of the shadows for just a moment. The whispers faltered, the shadows hesitating, and Mark realized that the carousel, now silent and still, was the key. He stumbled towards a control booth, the rusted metal door hanging loosely on its hinges, and pushed his way inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the broken glass crunched under his feet as he approached the control panel. His eyes fell on a lever, old and rusted, with a sign that read, "Emergency Stop." But beneath the rust, he saw another word, barely legible, "Release." Mark's heart pounded as he reached for it, the shadows creeping closer, their whispers now a deafening roar. The cold hand of fear gripped his heart, and for a moment he hesitated. What if pulling the lever only made things worse? What if it unleashed something even more malevolent? But the shadows were nearly upon him, the dark figure looming in the doorway, and Mark knew he had no choice. He pulled the lever with all his strength. A grinding sound echoed through the booth, the machinery groaning as if it hadn't been used in decades. The carousel lights flickered violently, and then, one by one, they shattered, plunging the park into darkness. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No whispers, no movement, only the suffocating silence of the night. Then, a scream tore through the air, a sound so primal and filled with rage that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. The shadows convulsed, the figures writhing in agony before dissolving into nothingness, their forms dissipating like smoke in the wind. Mark collapsed against the control panel, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The dark figure was gone, the presence that had filled the park with malice now lifted, but the air still felt heavy, charged with an energy that lingered like a storm that had yet to fully pass. He could still hear faint whispers, a reminder that whatever darkness had inhabited the carousel was not entirely gone. The shadows had retreated, but they were not vanquished. They were merely waiting, biding their time, and Mark knew that the terror was far from over. The carousel had claimed a piece of him, and somewhere in the darkness, it waited for its next victim. As Mark stumbled away from the control booth, the cold air of the abandoned park enveloped him. Despite the apparent vanishing of the shadows, a deep-rooted fear remained, gnawing at his sanity. It was the kind of fear that sank its teeth into the soul, one that didn't let go even when the immediate threat seemed to have passed. The darkness around him wasn't just the absence of light. It felt alive, thick with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. Mark could feel his perception beginning to warp, the silence around him a blank canvas for his terror-stricken mind to paint horrors upon. The whispers had ceased, but they left an echo behind, a lingering resonance that seemed to vibrate through Mark's skull. He found himself hearing sounds that weren't there, footsteps shuffling just beyond his sight, distant cries, and the ever-familiar laughter of children that now sounded hollow and disembodied. Every step Mark took felt labored, as if he were moving through an invisible fog that clung to his skin. He looked around, his eyes scanning the trailing, the rusting skeletons of other rides, and the carousel now shrouded in darkness. But nothing seemed real anymore. His senses were betraying him, blending the boundaries of reality and the nightmarish visions that haunted him. Suddenly, Mark saw movement in the distance, a fleeting figure, just beyond the shadows, darting behind an old, crumbling ticket booth. His heart skipped a beat, and he hesitated. Was it real, or just another trick his fear was playing on him? But then he saw it again, a flash of a silhouette, small and almost childlike, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Mark's throat tightened as he watched the figure vanish behind the booth, its form dissolving into the night. He knew he shouldn't follow it, knew that nothing good could come from chasing shadows, but there was something about it, a pull that was almost magnetic, urging him forward. The fear whispered to him, coaxing him to move, to see, to know. Mark tried to fight it, but his legs carried him toward the booth, each step echoing in the stillness of the night. As he approached, the air grew colder still, and a faint humming reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic tune that sent chills down his spine. It was a lullaby, one he vaguely recognized from somewhere in his past, a haunting melody that felt both comforting and deeply unsettling. The sound seemed to seep from the very walls of the booth, vibrating through the decaying wood and rusted metal. Mark rounded the corner, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness, and there it was, the figure, standing perfectly still. It was a child, or at least, it looked like one, though its features were obscured in shadow. Its head turned slowly, unnaturally, until it faced Mark. Two hollow eyes stared at him, empty and black, like voids that threatened to swallow him whole. The child's mouth opened, and the lullaby grew louder, a distorted version of the song that twisted into something grotesque and wrong. Mark felt his knees weaken, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. He wanted to run, to turn away and never look back, but he couldn't. The fear had him in its grasp, and he was paralyzed. The child took a step forward, its bare feet making no sound on the ground, and Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. He tried to speak, to shout, but no words came. The lullaby was inside his head now, drowning out his thoughts, filling him with a dread so profound that it felt as though his very essence was being drained away. The world around him began to blur, the edges of his vision darkening as the child approached. Mark could see its face now, pale, featureless, its mouth stretched into an unnatural smile, the kind of smile that was meant to mock rather than express joy. Suddenly, the figure lunged, and Mark stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard, the impact jolting him back to reality, and as he scrambled to his feet, the figure was gone. The lullaby had stopped, and the park was silent once more, but the fear remained. It was inside him now, a gnawing presence that refused to let go. His vision swam, and he realized that he could no longer trust his senses. The boundary between what was real and what was not had shattered, and the park was a maze of terrors, each corner hiding a new nightmare waiting to be discovered. Mark knew he had to leave, had to get away from this place before it consumed him completely. But as he turned to run, the world around him shifted again. The trees seemed to bend toward him, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it could give way at any moment. The shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and Mark realized that the fear wasn't just a feeling. It was a force, a living entity that thrived on his terror, growing stronger with each moment of his hesitation. He could hear the whispers again, faint and insistent, urging him to succumb, to let go of his sanity and become one with the darkness. The temptation was there, a dark part of him wanting to surrender, to let the fear wash over him and take him away from the pain and confusion. But somewhere deep inside, a flicker of resolve remained. Mark clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, the sharp pain grounding him, reminding him that he was still alive, still himself. He had faced the impossible, made his choice, and he refused to let this place take any more from him. With a final, desperate burst of energy, Mark pushed himself forward, running blindly through the darkness, the whispers fading behind him. The park seemed to shift around him, the rides and pathways blurring together, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The temptation of fear clawed at him, tried to pull him back, but Mark ran, driven by the faint hope that somewhere beyond the shadows, there was a way out, a way to escape the nightmare that had claimed so many before him. And as he ran, the lullaby echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder that the park, and the terror it held, would always be waiting. Mark ran until his legs could barely carry him, his heart pounding in his ears like a drumbeat of desperation. The darkness of the amusement park seemed to stretch endlessly, an abyss that swallowed everything, his sense of direction, his hope, even the concept of time. He found himself in front of Ferris wheel, its towering structure barely visible against the starless sky. The massive wheel loomed above him, rusted and broken, each of its seats swaying slightly in the wind as if they were whispering secrets from beyond. Mark felt an eerie pull, as though the wheel itself called to him, and he knew this was where he had to confront the source of the darkness. Taking a deep breath, Mark approached the Ferris wheel's base, where an old, twisted control panel lay covered in vines and grime. His fingers brushed against the rusted levers, feeling the cold metal beneath his skin. There was something here, something that the park wanted him to see. He looked up, and as his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he noticed something strange. One of the seats, suspended high above, wasn't empty. A shape, indistinct and shifting, sat there, its outline flickering as if caught between worlds. The whispering began again, louder now, and Mark understood. He had to face whatever was up there, whatever had bound this place to its curse. Slowly, he moved toward the rickety ladder that led to the base of the Ferris wheel. The metal creaked under his weight, groaning as if it might give way at any moment. With each step, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to blend into one, a voice he recognized, his grandfather's. The realization struck him like a blow, and he almost lost his grip, his heart leaping into his throat. The voice wasn't just calling to him, it was pleading, desperate and filled with pain. It was then that Mark understood the terrible truth. His grandfather's soul was bound to this place, trapped by whatever dark force had taken hold of the park. Reaching the top, Mark climbed into the seat opposite the shape. The cold was unbearable, an unnatural chill that seemed to pierce through his bones, but he forced himself to look. The figure was more distinct now, a spectral form with hollow eyes that stared blankly ahead. It was his grandfather, or what remained of him, a twisted echo of the man he had once known, his features contorted in agony. The ghostly figure turned to face Mark, its mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, Mark felt the words inside his head, an unspoken plea that tore at his heart. "Help me," the voice whispered, and Mark saw flashes of memories. His grandfather as a younger man, the day he first came to this park, the terrible accident that led to the closing of the amusement park. He saw how his grandfather had tried to stop the evil that had taken root here, how he had failed and been consumed by it. The carousel, the shadows, the whispers. It had all been the work of something far darker than Mark had imagined, a force that thrived on fear and suffering, feeding on the souls of those who dared to challenge it. Mark knew what he had to do, but the fear was overwhelming. He was just one person, standing against something ancient and malevolent, a force that had claimed countless lives before him. But he couldn't abandon his grandfather. Not after everything. The Ferris wheel began to move, creaking and groaning as it slowly turned. The ghostly figure staring at Mark with eyes filled with both hope and dread. The whispers became a cacophony, voices screaming in anger, trying to drown out his resolve. The darkness around him seemed to close in, the world narrowing to just this one moment. Mark closed his eyes, reaching out to touch the spectral form of his grandfather. It was cold, so cold that it burned, but he didn't pull away. He focused on the memories he still had, the warmth of his grandfather's laughter, the stories by the fire, the carved wooden horse. He poured every ounce of love and warmth he could muster into that touch, fighting against the cold, against the whispers that tried to tear him apart. The darkness resisted, a force that pushed back, trying to keep hold of its prize, but Mark wouldn't let go. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash, a burst of light that seemed to erupt from within the spectral form. The whispers turned into screams, an anguished wail that echoed through the park, and Mark felt the cold shatter, the darkness recede. The figure of his grandfather began to fade, his expression softening, the agony replaced with something that almost resembled peace. He looked at Mark one last time, his lips moving in a silent thank you, and then he was gone, the light dissipating into the night. The Ferris wheel ground to a halt, the park falling into a silence so deep that it seemed to swallow everything. Mark sat there, breathing heavily, tears streaming down his face. He had done it. He had freed his grandfather's soul, broken the hold that the darkness had over him. But he knew it wasn't over. The force that haunted this place had been weakened, but not destroyed. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. Mark climbed down from the Ferris wheel, his body aching, his mind exhausted. The park was different now. Still eerie, still abandoned, but the oppressive presence that had hung over it was gone. He knew he couldn't stay. He had faced the darkness, confronted it, but he had no intention of tempting fate any further. As he walked away, he looked back one last time, the outline of the Ferris wheel barely visible against the night sky. He knew he would never forget what had happened here, the terror, the pain, but also the hope. His grandfather was free, and that was enough. The whispers were gone, the shadows still, but Mark knew that the park held secrets that could never be fully buried. Somewhere in the darkness, the force waited, biding its time, and he could only hope that no one else would ever have to face the horrors he had. The temptation of fear, the darkness that thrived on it, would always be there, lurking in the forgotten corners of the world, ready to claim the unwary. And as Mark walked away, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of a lullaby, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone. It only waited. Mark stumbled through the darkness of the park, his entire body aching from the mental and physical battle he had just faced. Despite his success in freeing his grandfather's spirit, a sense of foreboding still hung over him like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. He knew it wasn't over. The evil that haunted this forsaken place was weakened, but not gone, and a part of Mark felt the inevitability of one last confrontation. It was like a rope pulling at him, drawing him back to the Carousel, the heart of the darkness. The Carousel lay in the distance, its once flickering lights now shattered, and its horses frozen in eerie silence. Mark approached cautiously, each step filled with dread. He could feel something watching him, an unseen presence lurking just beyond the boundaries of his senses, always staying one step out of view. The whispers that had haunted him had faded, but a new sound emerged, a low, throbbing hum that seemed to resonate from the very ground beneath his feet. It was a sound that carried with it a promise of violence, a warning that the fight was far from over. The carousel creaked as Mark drew near, the wooden horses seemingly caught mid-motion, their eyes now black and empty. The air around the ride felt heavy, the weight of countless souls that had been trapped here clinging to the structure. Mark could feel his fear rising, clawing at his insides, but he pushed it down. This time, he wouldn't let it control him. He stepped onto the carousel platform, the wooden boards groaning under his weight, and moved towards the center, a dark void where the machinery lay hidden beneath panels of rusting metal. Suddenly, the entire carousel shuddered, and Mark stumbled, almost losing his balance. The humming grew louder, an unearthly resonance that filled his bones with a sense of dread. Before his eyes, the horses began to move, their heads turning slowly, their hollow eyes now locked on him. The ground beneath him pulsed like a heartbeat, the rhythm quickening with every passing second. Mark's instinct screamed for him to flee, but he knew this was it, the final confrontation. The entity, the malevolent force that had claimed this place, was about to reveal itself. Without warning, the shadows around the carousel began to converge, swirling together to form a shape, an amorphous, shifting darkness that slowly took form. Mark's eyes widened as he watched the darkness coalesce into a towering figure, its body composed entirely of writhing shadows and the faces of those who had been claimed. The faces emerged from the dark, screaming silently, their expressions twisted in pain and fear, before sinking back into the void. The figure's eyes, two hollow voids, locked onto Mark, and he felt an icy wave of terror wash over him. The entity spoke, its voice a cacophony of all the souls it had consumed, each word dripping with malice. "You dare defy me," it hissed, the voices overlapping in a chorus of anger. Mark took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure seemed to swell, growing larger, the shadows spilling out across the platform, snaking towards Mark like 100 grasping hands. He knew he had to act now, or be consumed like the others before him. Mark's eyes darted around, searching for anything he could use, and then he saw it, a small glimmer of light beneath one of the carousel's panels. He dropped to his knees, prying the panel open with all his strength, the metal groaning as it gave way. Beneath it lay a cluster of old, rusted gears, and, wedged between them, a small, glowing object, a charm carved from bone, its surface etched with symbols. It pulsed with a soft, golden light, the only thing in the park untouched by the darkness. Mark reached for it, and the moment his fingers touched the charm, a warmth spread through him, a stark contrast to the icy grip of the shadows. The entity screamed, the sound reverberating through the night, and Mark felt the ground beneath him shudder violently. He clutched the charm, rising to his feet, the warmth now radiating through his entire body. The shadows recoiled, the tendrils withdrawing as if burned by the light. Mark held the charm high, the golden glow intensifying, pushing back against the darkness that surrounded him. The faces in the entity's form twisted in agony, their silent screams growing louder, and Mark knew that this was the source, the heart of the evil that had consumed the park. With every ounce of courage he could muster, Mark stepped forward, his eyes locked on the figure. "You won't take anyone else," he shouted, his voice trembling but resolute. The charm's light grew blinding, and the entity writhed, its form beginning to unravel. The shadows pulled away, the faces disintegrating into wisps of smoke, and the figure let out one final, ear-piercing wail before collapsing in on itself, the darkness imploding and vanishing into nothingness. The carousel shuddered, the machinery grinding to a halt, and for the first time since Mark had arrived, true silence fell over the park. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone, and the cold that had seeped into his bones began to fade. Mark stood there, breathing heavily, the charm still glowing softly in his hand. He looked around, and for a moment he could almost see the park as it once was, full of life, laughter, and joy. The souls that had been trapped here were free, the darkness banished, and the evil that had plagued this place destroyed. Mark stepped off the carousel, his body exhausted, but his heart lighter than it had been in what felt like an eternity. He knew that the park would always carry the scars of what had happened, but the malevolence was gone. The darkness, the whispers, the fear, they were no longer a part of this place. As he walked away, the charm still clutched in his hand, Mark knew that he had faced the very essence of terror and had survived. The park was silent, but it was a peaceful silence, one that promised that the souls of the lost were finally at rest. Mark glanced back one last time, the Ferris wheel now still, the carousel just a shadow of what it had been, and he allowed himself a small smile. The battle was over, and though the park would always hold its mysteries, its horrors, it was no longer a place of evil. He turned away, the wind rustling through the trees, and as he walked into the night, he knew that he had not only freed his grandfather, but had also reclaimed a part of himself that he had thought lost forever. The terror had tried to consume him, but in the end, he had emerged victorious, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt truly alive. Mark walked away from the abandoned amusement park, the chill of the night air finally giving way to a sense of warmth and relief. The charm, now faintly glowing in his hand, was a testament to his victory over the dark force that had consumed the place for so long. But even as the terror began to dissipate, a nagging feeling clawed at the back of his mind, a sense that something was left unresolved, a lingering whisper that refused to be silenced. He reached the edge of the forest, where his car was parked, and paused to look back one last time. The park lay shrouded in shadows, the Ferris wheel looming against the starless sky, the carousel now a silent relic. Mark felt a strange pull, a compulsion to return, as if the darkness was still calling to him, beckoning him back into its grasp. The charm in his hand pulsed once, faintly, as though in response to the unseen force. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease, but deep down, he knew that the story of this park was far from over. As he turned away, Mark heard a sound, a faint, distant melody that carried on the wind. It was the same lullaby, the haunting tune that had echoed through the park before, but now it was different, softer, almost sad, as if mourning something lost. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The wind rustled the leaves around him, and the melody grew louder, as if it was following him, refusing to let him go. Mark's heart pounded, and he clutched the charm tighter, its warmth no longer comforting, but instead a reminder of the darkness he had faced. He looked back at the park, and his eyes caught movement. Just a flicker, barely visible in the dim light, but enough to send a shiver down his spine. A shadow, darting between the skeletal remains of the rides, too quick to be real, too substantial to be imagined. Mark blinked, his breath caught in his throat, but the shadow was gone. The lullaby faded, the wind dying down, leaving only silence. But that single moment was enough to plant a seed of doubt. Was the darkness truly gone, or had it simply retreated, waiting for another chance to claim what it desired? Mark climbed into his car, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he drove away, the forest swallowing the view of the park behind him. Yet, as he sped down the winding road, the feeling of being watched refused to leave him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching him, following him. But there was nothing, only the empty road and the darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. He reached his apartment, the familiar surroundings bringing a sense of comfort, but it was fleeting. The charm lay heavy in his pocket, and as he pulled out, he noticed that the glow had faded completely, leaving only a dull, carved bone, cold to the touch. Mark placed it on his desk, but even then, it seemed to draw his gaze, a reminder of the horror he had faced. He turned away, trying to shake off the feeling, but sleep did not come easily that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces in the shadows, heard the whispers, felt the cold grip of the darkness. Days passed, and Mark tried to return to his normal life, but the park haunted him. He found himself sketching the carousel, the Ferris wheel, the shadowy figure over and over, as if trying to make sense of what had happened. The charm remained on his desk, a silent presence that seemed to watch him, its carved symbols an enigma he could not decipher. The more he looked at it, the more he felt that something had followed him back, a fragment of the darkness that had latched onto him, refusing to let go. One night, as Mark sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, the charm suddenly shifted, moving slightly as if pushed by an unseen hand. He stared at it, his heart pounding, the room growing colder with each passing second. The lullaby returned, faint and distant, echoing through his apartment, and Mark felt a chill settle in his bones. He turned, his eyes scanning the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room, and there it was, a figure barely visible, standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching him. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer, its form flickering like a candle flame, shifting between solid and shadow. The same hollow eyes stared at him, the same smile stretched across its face. It was the child, the entity that had haunted the park, and it was here, in his home, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone. The charm pulsed once more, the symbols glowing faintly, and Mark realized that the battle he had fought was not over. The park had let him leave, but it had not let him go. The figure vanished, the lullaby fading into silence, but the cold remained. Mark knew then that the darkness was a part of him now, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went. The park, the entity, the whispers, they had left their mark, and though he had survived, he had not escaped. The mystery remained, a question that would never be answered, a terror that would never be fully vanquished. And as Mark sat there, the charm glowing softly in the darkness, he knew that the carousel would turn again, the shadows would rise, and the whispers would call. The terror was far from over. It was only waiting, biding its time, and one day it would return, to the park, to him, or to someone else. The darkness was patient, and it knew that eventually it would find what it was looking for.